I think we're going to make a start. Welcome everyone to the launch of ARCO's Housing with Care Grey Paper. My name is Michael Voges. I'm the director of ARCO, and if you don't know ARCO, we're the trade association for both private and not-for-profit providers of housing with care operators here in the UK. And as such, our members provide services at the moment to about 30,000 older people, and we'd want to expand that sector to about 250,000 by 2030. Which I think makes this very much the fastest growing part of the social care sector. And just to be very clear, what we're talking about, and yes, we do have a terminology problem, housing with care, what we're talking about is extra care housing or retirement villages with care and support that sit very much between retirement housing or sheltered housing on the one hand and care homes on the other. I think that's where we're seeing a huge amount of interest from consumers, from policymakers, and from organizations who are coming in to open their first retirement community. I'll say a few words as an introduction before opening up our discussion. And what I'd first like to talk about is the why this is such a pertinent issue and why we've decided to launch this grey paper to really get the conversation going in more detail. And the reason for that really is that the health and social care landscape in the UK has changed and almost beyond recognition. So Katie, if we could have a graph here. And what we really talk about is that if you look at 30, 35 years ago, social care, housing-based solutions for social care were really around, we had 43,000 geriatric hospital beds in 1987, and then you had nursing homes and residential care homes providing for lower levels of needs and care. And maybe some of our panelists can actually talk about this, but actually you had people, recently someone described it was a charity that had run care homes for more than 100 years. They said back in those days, you might have people drop off their bags and then hop off on a world cruise afterwards. And as such, residential care wasn't actually that much about the care options and the support options. And if you needed higher levels of support, and if you had higher needs, you would probably be in a nursing home or in a long stay hospital. However, things have changed very dramatically, I think it's fair to say. So if you look at what we have today is that long stay hospitals and geriatric hospitals have largely been phased out. And what we now have is nursing homes and care homes have moved up the acuity scale and provide, I would say, very high levels and very high quality levels of care to people with very high levels of needs and acuity of needs. And I think that's a really interesting development that we've seen, I think largely driven by regulatory demands and challenges. And I think what we've also then seen is that there's that provision gap that now exists for people that have lower levels of care needs, medium levels of care needs, or need flexible care and support services as they age in place. Because of course, another factor is that in 1987, the average age of the average life expectancy in the UK was 75. It is now roughly 83. Now, so we know there is that provision gap. However, we also know that we're all still waiting for substantive reform proposals to put forward, and obviously the COVID pandemic has delayed that, and understandably so. The government was quite busy, or has been very busy for quite a while, but I think now questions are being asked around what will happen in this area. And because we are still waiting, we thought we would put together our own suggestions for a Housing with Care grey paper. And I should say that that title was actually Sally Greengross's, or Baroness Greengross's idea. She's our patron, which we thought was a very good one. So we put this together and asked a number of contributors to tell us what they thought about suggestions on what needed to change, but also personal reflections that would inform their work and informs really their dedication to this sector. And you can see the range of colleagues here, which we were very pleased with, and you will obviously be able to read a copy of the green paper, the grey paper, apologies, after the session. And some of the recommendations, if we can go to that next slide, included creating a Housing with Care task force, so bringing together different parts of the government in one, and creating more clarity in the planning system about what Housing with Care is and what incentives and targets we need to build more of them. There's also other points. So Jeremy Porteus, he talks about legislation that is needed, which is something we also very much agree with, not least to help consumer confidence. But it also goes beyond just our narrow sector and looks at things like lifetime homes, intergenerational housing, and also issues around what can we do for unpaid carers, which Lisa Cameron wrote her contribution about. And I think permeating some of this is, what is a sustainable system of social care reform looking like, and how can the government accelerate that? And I think Jane and Les are going to talk a bit about that in a moment. So if you have questions during our discussion, please do drop them in the Q&A section, and then we will go through after we've talked to our panelists. And with us here today, we have Jane Ashcroft, we have Bob Blackman, we have Lord Foulkes of Cumnock, and Professor Les Mayhew. And I'm going to introduce them briefly in turn, and they're going to give us their thoughts about they think what might need to change, both for our sector, but also in the wider social care debate. So if I can ask Bob to come on camera, so to kind of put his video on and unmute himself. There he is. Hello, Bob.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good to see you. And Bob is the MP for Harrow West. He is the member of the, East, apologies. East, member of the MHCRG Select Committee, and also the Executive Secretary of the 1922 Committee. And I think a retirement committee just opened in your constituency kind of about a year ago, just before the pandemic, the Landsby, which I think is where we first met, when it was actually still a building site. So that's
the Elysian development, which
that's
is
right.
An extremely good development and extremely welcome. And the only thing I was disappointed by was that they didn't take the bold move of making both blocks a retirement village, if you like, because of fear that they wouldn't be able to fill both blocks. But that's the way it goes. It's and so far, yes, it's in operation, very successful, and indeed has brought many people in that would otherwise probably not have considered such a means of housing for their older age.
Fantastic. And I think in your contribution, you write that you get approached quite often by constituents who, talk to you about housing issues, who may want to stay in place in Harrow East.
My constituency particularly is principally either owner-occupied or private rented sector properties. There's very little social housing in that respect. And the reality is that there's large numbers of people where the family have grown up and left home and moved on to their own accommodation, and therefore you've got large numbers of older people who are thinking, well, can I maintain this home, and could I move to an alternative home that might be best suited to the long-term needs? And also then the other attraction of that, of course, is it liberates a family home for a family that need it.
And where would those people be going at this stage? Or before something like the Landsby opened, what were the choices open to them in your constituency?
They'd have to move well out of London, probably, into a retirement village in the country, or alternatively, maybe sell their house and move in with their well, not children, but the sons and daughters, effectively in some sort of granny annex or whatever. But it's not really a practical proposition for most people, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah. And then in your contribution for the grey paper, you suggested more clearly defining different housing options for older people in the planning system, so including housing with care, and setting specific targets for those housing options. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
The reality is that it brings home to you the fact that we're talking about half the population having been vaccinated now, and we're only dealing with people aged over 50. We're not far off a position whereby the majority of people in this country will be age 60 plus, at which point those people that are in that position will be wanting to think about alternative provision going forward.
I think an interesting point for me, Bob, is always that we see the, people talk about baby boomers, but the interesting point for us is that the average age that people start thinking about these communities is normally around 75, and they move in their late 70s. Yeah. And interestingly, the baby boomers, the oldest baby boomers, have just turned 75. So those really large cohorts of older people are actually
and
just
going to get bigger. I mean,
I
think we're now at the stage where we've got 20,000 people in the UK who are aged 100 plus. It's only going to get bigger as a cohort, and therefore we have to be thinking about that.
Yeah. And in terms of the local plan in Harrow, is that
Yeah.
something that went into your local plan, and were you able to make representations there as well, or is that
Well,
something that you're
the
finding
local plan
difficult?
is being revised once again.
Mm.
Regrettably, I think the local planning phase is very complex. It seems to go on forever. And as soon as you've formulated one local plan, you seem to go into the next one. So it is difficult. I haven't had the opportunity of inputting to this, but we do know that the next local plan is going to take another 2 years to bring to fruition. And lots of things have got to go into the mix for that to happen.
And of course, you need to coordinate them with the London plan, which
Yep.
you know, for a London authority is particularly tricky to get all of that.
And we have to, you know, I think we do have this consideration of outer London, which is principally suburban, and inner London, which is principally urban or city centre type dwelling, and consider what people want for their housing going forward. You know, a lot of people who are older and retired want to go to leisure facilities and hospitality centres. They want to go to museums, they want to go to parks, they want to, you know, they want to go to the theatre, etc., and have more time and possibly more disposable income to do that. So for London and cities, it's absolutely vital that appropriate accommodation is available for people. Otherwise, we end up literally depopulating our towns and cities, or just populating them with people that are working age, who then don't have time to use these facilities.
Yeah, that's true. I have to say, in my local area in South London, since we've had kids, my wife and I, our usage of local restaurants has dropped off considerably. Let's put it that way. So
for a year, most of us have dropped off using local
even before the
restaurants.
pandemic, Bob. Even before the pandemic. And then in terms of the housing options, like, do you think the planning system currently makes it clear enough what the different options are? Because I think, and this is something that I would say the industry needs to get better at as well, is that, you know, my introduction was, I talked about housing with care, retirement communities, extra care housing. And I think there's quite there is a range within that, but I think there's always the issue of, you know, some things are more apartments and they try and be housing with care and others don't. So is there a need for more clarity within that system?
There's definitely a need for clarity. I mean, I've got, in my constituency, I've also got a wonderful, I mean, it's Jewish Care that are providing this, where literally they've put in, obviously it's for Jewish people, but the model applies, where they've literally put in blocks that now encourage people to go into them when they're fully functional, and then gradually, as their needs become greater, then they move down towards more and more care, but they're still in the same facilities. So that from that perspective, it's not the big jump, which can be the concern. And I think that's a model that could be used for other different communities as we go forward.
Really interesting one, because Jewish Care, who are also a member of ours down in, obviously they have one in Golders Green already, and then the Stanmore one, which is for rent, I believe, which again is an interesting development, which make things more flexible about moving around. So I think we're seeing quite a bit of tenure flexibility being demanded from customers, really, which is an interesting one.
Yeah.
Brilliant. I'm sure there'll be lots of other questions, Bob. So if you stay with us.
My apologies, but I am going to have to leave early.
Yeah.
Because I've got to pose questions to the Home Secretary in about 15 minutes. So.
I'll just see. Do you know what? I'm just going to see if there's any questions in here that I can ask you now. And I think there's a question around. I think I might go to Lord Foulkes next, but you know, I understand that you need to get your priorities right, and Home Secretary questions. I'll let that one pass. So that's okay. So thank you very much, and thank you for your contribution, Bob. That's very much appreciated, and I'm sure we'll continue working together more in the future. Thank you very much, Bob. And if I could ask Lord Foulkes of Cumnock to put on his camera, and while he does that, I'm just going to say that there you are, George. Hello.
Hi, Michael.
Lord Foulkes is a Labour peer and was previously an MP, and he was also director of Age Concern Scotland, if I'm getting that right.
Yep.
And the chair of Age Scotland. So you do know a thing or two about what you're talking about. And
that's kind of you.
And your contribution, it was interesting to read that you stayed with your grandparents in the northeast of Scotland at the end of the Second World War, and you write that they were the lucky ones. and they had a good house.
They were
close to shops.
Can I say first of all, Michael, how pleased I am and grateful to you for asking me to contribute along with the others, and also to congratulate ARCO on producing this great paper. I think you've done a great job by doing that.
Thank you.
I'm pleased to participate along with the 13 others. I was going to say you end up with 14 shades of grey, but you might get people reading it for the wrong reasons if I said that. But I won't say that. But I stayed with my grandparents, and mind you, that was way back in the 1950s, and things were very different then. But it was only when I got down to Glasgow and living in Edinburgh that I saw the dreadful housing conditions that so many people lived in, which is probably one of the main reasons I ended up as being a member of the Labour Party, to try and improve the situation.
Yeah. And I think in terms of, you were saying that at the time, there weren't really many options of, even sheltered housing didn't really exist back in the day, right?
No, that was astonishing. I mean, the options were either you had to stay where you'd been in adequate accommodation, or as you said in your introduction, maybe there was a geriatric hospital, but there were the care homes, and they were awful at the time. I mean, they were really big institutional buildings. And it was really started off in Aberdeen, this concept of sheltered housing, and we built it up and developed it in Scotland, and others did in England and elsewhere for a period of time. And it seemed like a revolutionary concept at the time. But of course now it's just part of what you're suggesting, and rightly so, should be a widening range of options, because it's not just that there are many, many more older people, but thankfully we're living longer in retirement, so that our time in retirement is a big chunk, up to a third of your life could be spent in retirement, and so it has to be carefully planned for. And moving house is now much more complicated than it used to be. There are so many things you have to change. Your addresses on your passport, on your driving license, all the technological changes that have to be made, make it more and more difficult for people to move house. And therefore, if you can get an accommodation, which, as you said in your introduction, and Bob was raised this in relation to that lovely model of Jewish care, that you can be there, and as you need more and more help and support, it's there for you.
And do you think that the attitudes of older people have changed? So if you think back to your age concern days and that post-war generation and older people of today, and I think you mentioned yourself that obviously you've you're not a spring chicken anymore. If I kind of could summarize that way. I
said when Brian Sloan asked me to be chair of Age Scotland, he said you director of Age Concern Scotland in the 1970s. Now you've got a more direct interest in it, and he's absolutely right. So I do see it myself, and I think, you become much more aware. I mean, it's good for people like you, Michael, to talk about it, and you're doing a great job, but you're talking about it in abstract. But once you get into the age group yourself, you realize how dramatic things can be, and how you become, as I say in my contribution, you become more aware of your mortality. You become more aware that as you get older, you find it more difficult to move around, and it isn't abstract anymore. It's practical, and that's why a variety of accommodation is important. The other thing I feel very strongly about, we had a report in the House of Lords about intergenerational divisions, and they were talking about intergenerational rivalry. I think we should, and I'm glad you're doing it, talk more about intergenerational cooperation, because so much can be learned by older people from the young, and by young people from older people, and that can be. I mean, I've been lucky enough to travel abroad, and I've seen examples of in the same building, older people living with students in a different part of the same complex, and elsewhere a day centre for older people with children, and that we need to look to be much more imaginative in relation to that. and to look at this intergenerational provision. I'm a bit worried that in Edinburgh, where I'm living, there are these housing complexes for students going up that are in danger of becoming ghettos for students, and which is unfortunate. And it's the commercial pressure that's making it, which is why I think what you said earlier about planning and making sure that we think ahead in a collective way and get the right kind of provision. And that's why I strongly support what you're suggesting of a United Kingdom task force. Strongly support that. But I would go further, 2 steps further. First of all, because of devolution, housing is dealt with by the Scottish government and the Welsh government, Northern Irish government. So we need a task force there as well. And then, as Bob said, and as you said in your discussion with them, it's the councils that are doing the work on the ground. And so councils need to be motivated as well. And I used the example when I was involved with one of my other interests of the developing world. And I was very keen to get councils to develop and to become fair trade councils, so that they were buying products which were produced in a sustainable way and by people who were not being exploited. And they put up on their way into the councils a fair trade council. And I think you could do the same in relation to housing, that they could become champions for housing for all people. I didn't like the acronym for that. It ends up with CHOP, which is not, so we'll need to put it the other way around, I think, to get a better acronym. But I think that I think you and ARCO and Age UK and Age Scotland and other organisations should be asking councils to take on this and become a champion for all the people.
Yeah, and I think the interesting comparison really to Scotland is that what we've seen is that talking to some of your or to some operators who are looking at the Scottish context, is that interestingly New Zealand is one of the world leaders in retirement villages provision, and the population of New Zealand is actually not too dissimilar to that of Scotland, and I think it can be done. It's also a very a country which is very large with some urban centres, very very similar to the Scottish context. So we're excited to see what can happen up there.
I know New Zealand well. My son's there at the moment, and he worked there for many years. He's out there again, and we visited New Zealand on 2 or 3 occasions, and I'm very impressed by what they've done. They've got an excellent Prime Minister, incidentally, there at the moment. That's not a party political point. That's just a practical point. And we have, I think, if your figures are right, about 0.6% of our housing is in this category. But in New Zealand, it's 6 or 8, between 6 and 8%. But I think we should look at the example in New Zealand, Australia, Denmark. I think is also quite a good example. And I hope the task force would look at examples in other countries. Yep. We can learn a lot from other countries.
That's fantastic, George. Thank you very much. And we'll come back to question and answers in a bit. I'd like to ask Jane Ashcroft to pop her camera on. There she is, Jane. And Jane probably needs little introduction at ARCO events. She is the Chief Executive of Anke Hanover, one of the founding members of ARCO, also Vice Chair of ARCO. And as such, Jane, I know you have plenty of contact with older people in your day job. And I think what I found interesting about your contribution was really around the fact that older people, they're not just receivers of care, but they're often caregivers, their husbands, wives, grandchildren, neighbors, friends, as well as those people that may need a bit of support here and there. And I think that's really where, we must treat them in the way that they feel valued and that they feel treated with respect. And I think that's not a political point, obviously, but a value-driven imperative. And that's something that I very much agree with. But you also talk about that we need to stop the all talk, no action approach to social care reform and restore some trust in the long-term sustainable plan for social care. And that would include housing with care, of course. So what are the main points that you'd like to emphasize?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, Michael. So across Anke Hanover, we support about 60,000 older people in a range of different services. And I suppose my reflection, 25 years into the sector, probably a bit longer, is that there are lots of different needs, requirements, aspirations, expectations we should see the older people's housing with care market as a market, and recognise there are different segments, to use the kind of marketing speak. And the word choice, I think, has come up in every conversation so far. Bob talked about choice, George has talked about choice. This is about really making sure we'll have different experiences, all of us, of later life. And I think too often in the past, there's been a tendency to see older people as this homogenous group, as if some magic age hits us, I don't know, 65 or 70, and we all become the same. And actually, there is a huge range of requirements and needs and services. And yeah, I mean, I think when I wrote my piece for the grey paper, I was probably feeling a bit of frustration about, you know, we have been talking about this for a really long time. I think the important thing is to look to the future. It's kind of, we mustn't kind of try and rewrite history. I suppose over the last year, you mentioned at the beginning, you know, the delay on the green paper has been understandable in view of the conditions that we've all been dealing with. But I suppose my reflection is that there are three issues that as a country we've been grappling with for quite some time. One is around social care and how we deliver and fund an appropriate social care system. The housing crisis, you know, the expression the housing crisis now is accepted, I think, across all political parties in most parts of the country. That we have a crisis in this country of not enough suitable housing. And the issue that George was talking about intergenerational fairness, those were all factors 2 years ago that as a country, as a, you know, the government, any group of people were aware of all of those things. The pandemic has kind of heightened all of those things. It's heightened the need for us to do something about social care. It's heightened issues about housing. We've really seen, haven't we, that your housing has made a big difference to your experience of the pandemic. And blimey, the intergenerational fairness thing sings loud as well, doesn't it? As we look forward and think about how we're going to rebuild, you know, how we're going to build back better, how we're going to rebuild our economy, how we're going to find jobs and careers. And so, when I look at the grey paper and I look at the work that we're doing at ARCO and across the sector, in some ways, housing with care is a gift, because it helps address all of those things. It addresses the issues around social care that we're grappling with. It addresses issues around the housing crisis. And it helps to make sure that we're a country that can move forward that's fair for all generations. So I think I would say this, wouldn't I? You quite rightly said I'm the Vice Chair of ARCO, and obviously we're a large provider of services, but enabling this market to flourish really does, really ticks a number of policy areas, but more importantly to me, it makes a big difference to lots of families. And I mean, you'll have heard this before, Michael, but I don't apologise for retelling my tale. Now, we look at graphs all of the time about, and my piece, I talk about some of the numbers, the under provision, the increasing numbers of older people, the great news that we're all living longer. But I regularly reflect on a 105th birthday party I went to a couple of years ago. I think Bob talked about the number of people over 100 in the country. We've got about 250 centenarians living in Anchor Hanover services. And I was lucky enough a few years ago to be with somebody who was celebrating her 105th birthday in one of our services. She'd been, she had no care needs, lived in a retirement housing setting, and was celebrating her 105th birthday with her son, who was 80, had just had his hip replaced, recently lost his partner, needed actually quite a lot more support than his mum. His daughter, who was about 50, her daughter, who was in her mid-20s, and her little one, who was 2, who was tottering around with a piece of cake that was looking quite precariously like it was about to fall on the floor at any minute. And when I look at that setting, to me says everything about why we've got to address issues around housing with care. That was a 5-generation family. There were issues there about support for each generation. So 105-year-old actually doing really well, didn't need any care. The 80-year-old, as I say, was in need of some personal care and some support. The 50-year-old in the middle, trying to work out how to support her daughter who'd just gone back to work. She was providing childcare. She was doing some support of her dad. Our society's changed. Demography has changed. We've got to rethink so many things. And I think that the challenge we have is sometimes the complexity of this feels really, it touches on obviously social care, it touches on housing policy, it touches on planning policy, it touches on financial services and models. And so I think we've got to kind of cut through some of this stuff. So the ARCO ask of, can we get a task force that's focused on how we can remove some barriers? I think many of the things that we need to stimulate growth of this sector are about removing barriers rather than putting new things in place. There are new things that we could do, but it could really, really make a difference.
Yeah. And I think for me, well, probably a question for the wider panel, but I think part of the issue that we have sometimes when we're talking with the government is that these issues are, as you say, it's part of a much wider continuum and a part of much wider options. However, some of the economic drivers are very different. And I think sometimes what we find ourselves discussing is, and I can say I understand why, but that it's difficult to discuss, for example, if you're looking at supported housing for people with mental health needs and learning disabilities, which is a market I used to work in and I know very well. That is a market which is 99.5% state funded. And then it's difficult to maybe have that conversation at the same time as discussing what can people with 1.3 billion pounds of housing wealth potentially afford as their personal choice. And I think there's issues that we need to work through there, ideally, of course, in a task force. But Jane, we'll come back. We'll have question and answers in a minute, which we'll come to. So thank you very much for your comments now. And finally, I'd like to introduce Les Mayhew, who is the Professor of Statistics at City University's Business School and also the head of Global Research at the International Longevity Centre. So Les, if you can pop your camera on and your microphone, that would be fantastic. Les also recently wrote a report on us on the fact that there's, I think it was 19 million, wasn't it, spare or underutilized bedrooms in the UK at this point in time. So that was a very interesting study you did.
Yeah, I think it was, well, I looked at 2020, 2030, 2040. From memory, in 2040, it was about 22 million spare bedrooms, of which 12.5 million were centred on the 65 plus population, who are now going to total a massive 18 million people in the UK by then. Yeah. So that's a story, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think in your contribution, Les, I found it interesting because you use your mum as an example, and the way that she may have actually been one of those people who might have benefited from not going to a care home because her needs weren't that great, but maybe something where she had a bit more support, and not least a change in the kind of the physical setting, because I think that the stairs and the maisonette she was in was a challenge, which really kind of brought the point home, I thought.
Oh, that was terrible. You know, every time it was a nightmare. Every time someone knocked on the door and she had to go down the stairs to open the door, that was a sort of danger moment for her. And she did have several falls. But it's quite clear in hindsight that if she lived in more age-appropriate accommodation, her story would have been very much different, and she might have lived on another 5 years or more. She was just a bit forgetful sometimes, that's all, but she had all of her marbles.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, go on.
That's what I was going to say. On a policy suggestion or contribution, you were saying that you're interested in the role of the private sector in investing in high quality housing options and using private housing wealth, both for housing and for social care, actually. And you also mentioned the need for planning reform. So what's the link between those issues, and tell us more?
Well, I think you've got to have a reason to want to do this. And one of the things that brought me into this topic was the preventive effect of good accommodation. And I did a big study 10 years or more ago for the Department of Health, but that was in a sort of distributed community setting, care coordination of lots of different services. And it did work. It worked very, very well. The reason was the timelier intervention before the crisis or the fall had impacted on the individual, timelier assessment and delivery of essential services. But then more recently, 2016-17, we were invited to look at a retirement village. In fact, it was Whiteley Village. I think Chandra is one of the contributors to the Foulkes executive, one of the contributors. And this was really interesting because that village was 100 years old. So we had 100 years worth of historical records. So we could also measure whether there were life extensions as well as, a general satisfaction with living there. And of course, we found there was huge satisfaction, but a major finding, which I think resonates with what we're talking about now, was a potential boost to life expectancy, in this particular case up to 5 years. And this was particularly interesting because the village is renowned for being the residents coming from poorer backgrounds who you would normally not expect to live as long. And again, why did it work? Well, I think the point's been made before. It's because all the services are in one place under one roof. There's an immediacy of response, but people were also notably happy. There were lots of communal activities, and I think, unlike my first example, isolation was not an issue, and I think we will probably keep coming back to that. So that kind of put me on to how can we make this available for more people? Well, one of the problems is the supply side. We've already talked about that, and we've already talked about downsizing as well, which would free up lots of homes and incidentally also make it easier for younger cohorts to get on the housing ladder. But I think the key thing, and it was mentioned by another speaker, it might have been Bob, and that's the complexity of moving home today. So the more help you can put in place, the better it becomes. So what are the objectives of someone who in this space? I think one is being sure of having enough money to see you through to the end of life. Another one is perhaps having something left over for gifting or inheritance, and also have enough income to pay expenses, preferably no unbudgeted surprises like having to fix a hole in the roof. And when I was doing the work for you last year, I was really impressed by these new financial models that are available which help you do this, such as the deferred fees model. These shield you from unexpected costs, and if you lease, you're also guaranteed to get the purchase price of the lease less charges and fees back, which is fantastic. We also noted, as you hinted, about problems in the planning sector. I'm not a great expert on the planning system, but it was quite apparent that I think it was something like 62% of all local authorities had no specific plans for retirement housing, which obviously the combination of the personal uncertainty about whether you can afford it or not, and the supply side are combined to make this a particularly tricky problem. However, there was also one uncovered risk even in this new arrangement that we've been discussing just now, which is if you need long-term care. And we know that buying insurance for long-term care can be a huge strain on your current income in retirement, and perhaps make it even more difficult for you to move into retirement accommodation. And also paying just a one-off premium would be expensive. And this is probably why the Dilnot proposals have never really come to fruition, this potential upfront cost or ongoing cost. So what did I propose in my suggestion? Well, we've also looked at several options, including paying a regular premium, but the one that made most sense was as follows. It involves ceding a small proportion of your property equity to pay for long-term care insurance, but the premium for which would not be paid until after death or the house is sold. And it worked out pretty well. Actuarially, it worked, it made sense. It wasn't a huge percentage of the equity in your home. Why? Well, because only around 30% of people end up needing any long-term care anyway. So I think you can imagine that leads to quite reasonable sums of money. So who will benefit from this? Obviously, we're not talking about self-funders here, Michael, but I think we are talking about people that are perhaps asset rich but income poor, and I estimate there's probably around 2 million of those in the population. And I'd really like to see some insurer picking this up and running with it, and perhaps working with these other financial arrangements like the deferred fees model to see whether we can integrate them in a more meaningful and useful way going forward.
Thank you, Les. And do you know what? I think if I could ask the other contributors, so George, Foulkes, and Jane, to come back on camera, because some of the questions really kind of touch on some of the issues that we've discussed right now. And if I maybe actually stay with you, Les, just for the first follow-on.
Okay.
There's a question really, because you mentioned the deferred fee model where some of the risks of repairs, service charge increases, where effectively it's a kind of, you know, there is an element of equity release that is similar to what you described, obviously not quite the same.
Yes.
And I think we're seeing quite a lot of that, which is very popular with consumers, but there's a question, how do you justify those high fees in certain retirement villages? Not the leaseholder or the heirs. And I think my answer to that would be that I'm not actually aware that you have villages with very high fees where there isn't any quid pro quo. And often there is that risk transfer onto the operator to give that back. So kind of just your views. You said you find those quite interesting, but just maybe if you want to expand on that.
Well, the first point I'd make is that once you're retired, you live off basically a fixed income. Your pension, you might have an annuity. You're not going to, you might get some inheritance at that age, but it seems unlikely. So you want a pretty smooth ride with no surprises. And I've not investigated particular examples of this deferred fees model, although I'm aware there are 2 or 3 schemes available. And I think this is where advice comes in, because it has been said several times, moving house, especially at that age, is quite complicated. Lots of things to consider, and that also taking into account your personal objectives. Do you want to leave some money behind or give that money? Do you want to make sure your house is not taken away from you by buying or investing in long-term care, in insurance, and all those things? So there's a complexity of issues to put together there, which really needs some sound, independent financial advice. But I think we've got all the tools we need in the toolbox. We just need to make it work.
I think that's an interesting point. If I can go to maybe George or Jane, I mean, transparency is something that ARCO said is extremely important here. And one of the big differences between the UK and other countries, and George, you were mentioning international best practice, is that other countries with a flourishing market for this, they all have like a Retirement Villages Act or Continuing Care Retirement Communities Act, much of which is focused on consumer protection, which is something that ARCO is very much in favor of. So I don't know, first on that transparency point, maybe first Jane and then George.
Yeah, I would just reinforce the importance of, and it links to choice as well. I think there is no one model that works for everybody. And at the moment, we're used to a very sort of limited approach to housing, funding our housing for people, and people are used to a weekly fee in a care home. And actually we do need to give people a range of options for how to fund services. As Les says, for many people the issue is about a limited income, and the importance of how they can make best use of that income. Some people are asset rich and income poor, as we know. So I think it is about information and advice, as Les has said, and absolute transparency. And yeah, you know, as founder members of ARCO, the consumer protection aspect of that is one of the things that really drew us to it. And we've looked at other countries, as you say, Michael. And one of the things, my comments about recognizing that older people are consumers. So I think it's really important not to think about older people en masse as a group of people about whom we have to feel terribly paternalistic and everybody's vulnerable and everybody. Undoubtedly, there are some people who are vulnerable and some people who do need to be provided with a degree of protection, but that is not all older people by any means. And very much the people who live in our services have a bag of life experience and a set of views and knowledge that enable them to make choices. But what they need is clear information, transparent information, and access to good advice.
Yep.
Yes, I agree fully. One of the things that worries me is that a lot of the influence, a lot of the determination of what happens is done through commercial pressure. Now, I'm not wanting to make a political point, but this is what actually happens. Whereas if there is planning, careful planning and thought about it, and there hasn't been enough thought about what needs to be done. And I think it was Miles that raised the question about moving, because I suddenly realized myself in my own situation about moving from one place to the other, how complicated it is now compared with what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. There's so many more things you have to do. It's much more difficult now. It has to be done mostly online. We have the problems of the digital divide and older people keeping up. Some older people keeping up. Some are quite good. Some are whiz kids on that. Others aren't. But I do think what we need to do is to try and think of the flexibility that you can get accommodation, which you can stay in for quite a long period of time, but in which the support changes during that period. So you start off being pretty independent, doing what you like, getting out and about, but as you get older, you need more support, and it's there. But the facilities nearby are required all the time. I was being very old-fashioned, and you will tell me off, Jane, when I was said that when I was very young and staying with my grandparents, my grandfather liked where we stayed because the pub was next door. My grandmother liked it because the shops were just around the corner. Now, sorry about that. That's changed a lot now. We all go to the pubs and we all go to the shops now, fortunately. But can I also say a good thing has come out already, Michael, out of this? I've had an email from Andrew Fife in Scotland, who's working with Gareth Lyon at ARCO, yep, and with Aberdeen University. So things are moving, yep, but I think it needs to be done. And I'm not a nationalist, as you know, but I think that we need to do things now increasingly, and I hope ARCO will take account of this more, on a country by country basis. And if there's going to be a national plan, it needs to be, until there's devolution to England, it needs to be an English plan organised by the UK government, one by the Scottish, one by the Welsh, and one by the Northern Irish government. But then local authorities being key in it.
And we'll come to a local authority question. I would like to say just to Jane and also your, George, comments about the decision makers is we're currently doing a project whereby we're asking residents over Zoom, we're talking to them via Zoom and asking them why they moved. And a surprisingly large number of them don't have care needs at this point in time, probably about half, probably more than half. But what they all say is, look, I don't want my daughters to have to gun it up the motorway, or my son lives in Hong Kong, and basically I need to plan for the moment when something will happen. And I think that moment whereby, we know from other works that about half the residents will actually have a care plan in place of some shape or form, but that can be several years in the future. And I think it's a really interesting one, that thinking of their children is something that I think is probably a new thing, because this is a generation of people who've seen maybe what it was like to care for their own parents in circumstances where this might not have been available.
I think that's true, Michael. We in Anchor Hanover, we did some research. It's probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, and spoke to people about their anticipated care needs. And one of the really strong things that came through was people. I mean, many people don't have children. So not everybody has children they can rely on, but also a lot of people said, I don't want my children to be providing the care for me. And I think, you mentioned that in the grey paper, we talk about this issue around family carers and unpaid carers. And I think that it's a huge issue. Again, the pandemic has shown us the number of people who are caring for members of their family. And not only might that not be what people want in terms of their dignity, in terms of the nature of their relationships in the family, it's also taking people out of the workforce who want to be in the workforce. And that has an economic impact. It has an impact on their savings for later life. So we really do need to, and I think in the past there has been some, if I could call it, slightly sort of lazy policy thinking about families, families doing more. Oftentimes the family contribution may well be partly a financial contribution, but to say families need to do more and pick up the care is really not what most of us would want, I don't think, in our later lives. And we really need to sort of bust some of those myths.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I think George was mentioning something about the councils, and there's a question here from Phil Schmidt around how do we tackle the growing negativity of local authorities and planners towards retirement housing, and that could be indirectly via arbitrarily high affordable housing targets, or more directly with comments such as retirement communities are ghettos and there's a lack of vibrancy, and those are comments that you don't get when you plan for other issues. So how do we convince local authorities that this is actually a good thing and not a bad thing?
Well, I would make a start on. I think there's a hearts and a minds issue here. There's some facts that we need to keep bringing to the fore. So I have heard in the past concerns about from planners and local authorities that building retirement communities attracts older people, and that puts pressure on local services like social care and healthcare. And I think there's a huge amount of evidence that that simply isn't the case. That people generally move into a facility nearby. That people don't move around the country. The lack of supply can encourage that behaviour. The more supply we have, the less likely that is to happen. But the vast majority of people want to stay in the community they've always been in. And actually, when they move into a specialist retirement environment that's purpose-built, they're less likely to need social care and healthcare. So we've got stats, we've got data, and we can use that. And I think that the other point about perceptions and, you know, ghettos for older people, we just need to, and it's been difficult during the last 12 months, we need to get people to come and see our facilities. They are vibrant communities. The place I wish I'd been in the last 12 months, instead of stuck in my Zoom box at home, is in one of our services, because generally people have been in resilient communities where, despite the limitations that we've all had placed on us, people have been able to support each other. So I think it's a really important stakeholder group for us, local authorities, particularly planners, to challenge the really out-of-date perception of what older people's services and housing with care are like. So open door invitation, once it's safe to do so, any planner can come and see anything of ours, and I challenge them to want to go back to where they currently live. They'll want to buy an apartment off me.
One of the things that, sorry Les, but
I was going to say, I think one of the contributing factors, and this is probably slightly controversial, is that social care has been underfunded for many years, and it's coupled with this policy of looking after people in their own homes for as long as possible, so to speak. And I do question whether that's the right answer in every case. And I think with a more inclusive and integrated policy, we might be able to get round that a bit, and it would take pressure off local social services. After all, they've got to visit people's houses. They spend a long time on the road. It's a very specialist area. There are problems about what's the right level of earnings, and all those things sort of come together. And I wonder where we ought to be opening up this area to what we're talking about today, and seeing whether or not there's a better solution.
I think one of the things that comes out in the grey paper, Michael, is the problems of nomenclature. What do you call?
Yes.
Is it housing with care? Are there retirement villages? And I just wondered if, again, in terms of intergenerational working together, whether or not, and maybe Jane can answer this, whether organisations like Hanover and Anchor, or Hanover Anchor, and all the others, could not work with universities, for example, or with other providers of accommodation for other groups, to try and get some kind of integrated provision, so that, for example, the provision for older people might be on the ground floor of a development, and for others above it. And it does seem to me there's greater opportunity for working together, and you wouldn't have the same kind of problems with local authorities. And if we could get it, I think that's happening in again, back to what I said, Michael, about looking at other countries. If I remember, what I saw in Denmark was very much that kind of arrangement.
I think certainly we've seen that where there've been examples where older people have been given the choice, what do you want built here? They actually saw that there was one case where there was one of the big developers tried to build a like executive homes development on that spot in the Greenbelt, and the local residents, they fought it off twice, two different proposals. And then when one of our members came along, they realized, well, hang on a minute, if I move there, then my house can go to my children or someone of that age. And I think suddenly it went from hundreds of letters in objection to actually letters in support of that application, because people could see, to Jane's point, that it was that local provision. Well, thank you very much. I think we're unfortunately running out of time, but what I would say to just kind of sum up our discussion, I think we all realize that there's an imperative to get things done. And I think Jane mentioned there's as much a practical point to make this happen, but also one, it's a moral point. We need to create better options for older people to give them more choice, more independence, make that happen. Les actually summed up the benefits of the social care debate and the freeing up the bedrooms extremely well. So I think we need to make that happen. I think we also need to see this as more than just an England thing. And George, that's definitely something whereby, you know, I think Gareth and Andrew are discussing, and that needs to go wider. I know that there's now, I think the first application for a retirement village in Belfast was lodged about 6 months ago. So like there's some movement here. And then the third point I think that I'm taking away from this is that once the pandemic is over, ARCO shall be organising bus tours for planners to visit local authorities. We'll ship them around the country to see what our members have to offer, and hopefully that will win the hearts and minds.
And maybe a visit to New Zealand as well.
We should fly them over once they let us in again.
I'm
George,
up for
once
that.
they let us in again. So, you know, we'll try. So thank you very much for your contributions here today to the panelists, to Jane, George, and to Les and Bob. Thank you very much also to the wider contributors to the Social Care Green Paper, and again to Sally actually for suggesting this in the first place. I would also thank everyone for your questions and for tuning in today, and also my colleagues Sam and Katie, who A, pulled this together, and B, made sure that the event today went so smoothly. And the video will be available on our website soon, and the report should be emailed to you. So I'm really grateful for your support. Plenty left to do, but I'm sure we all agree that will be worthwhile to keep up the fight. So
thank you, Michael, for holding us together.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
great work.
Good rest
Good
of the
to see
week.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye bye.
All right.